Tonight you're listening to the morning the evacuation notice went up. This story takes place inside a wooden boarding house on Bush Street in San Francisco's Japantown in the spring of 1942. At that time, the neighborhood lived under a rising cloud of fear. FBI arrests had already taken fathers, radios carried hostile rumors, and families whispered through thin walls about night raids and curfews. Everyone felt the ground shifting, even before any orders were posted. This narrative drama is part of Stories from Camp, a relaxing nighttime series of first-person historical stories from the Japanese-American experience during World War II. Factually grounded fictional stories based on books by Japanese-American authors and researchers. This story follows Max Morita, a young Nisei man living on the third floor, as he wakes to an ordinary morning that suddenly breaks open. Through his eyes you'll feel the fog on Bush Street, the wooden boards underfoot, the soft sounds of families waking, and the moment when a single knock on the front door changes the entire rhythm of the house. Settle in, breathe, and let the story unfold as you fall asleep.
A Day Inside a Japantown Boardinghouse. 1942. Act 1. A house waking on thin walls. Max Morita woke before the rest of the boarding house, the way he had learned to do ever since moving into his small third-floor room on Bush Street. Dawn had barely touched the windows, yet the building already murmured with its usual chorus. Pipes ticked inside the walls. A kettle clattered lightly somewhere on the first floor. Someone shuffled across the hallway in slippers, half asleep, heading toward the bathroom they all shared. The walls carried every sound as if they were made of paper, and Max listened to them the way some people listen to music, letting the rhythms tell him how the day might unfold. He sat up in bed, feeling the familiar press of the thin mattress beneath him. His room held only what a single young man needed: a narrow cot, a small dresser, one worn-down chair, and a window that faced the alley where morning deliveries would soon echo. He kept a shallow basin of water near the sill. The basin caught whatever light the sky offered, and Max splashed the cold water across his face, waking slowly, deliberately. Outside, a sliver of pale gold crept across the wall, hinting at another San Francisco morning that would feel ordinary until it didn't. He pulled on his shirt and stepped into the hallway. The boards beneath his feet gave a soft sigh with each step. Children's drawings he had taped up for the Nakamura sisters lined one section of the wall, their edges curling from humidity. The drawings always made him smile. They were small reminders that even in crowded conditions, even in uncertainty, life insisted on finding color. Mrs. Kanda's voice carried up the stairwell before he even reached the second floor. She was already in the kitchen, speaking half in Japanese, half in English, apologizing to someone about the rice ration. The hint of worry in her tone was familiar. Food stretched differently now than it had a year ago. Max leaned over the railing and called down a gentle good morning. She looked up, one hand on her hip, the other stirring something in a pot too small for the number of mouths she fed. Her smile was tired but warm. Max continued downward, letting the smell of old wood and last night's miso guide him. The boarding house always felt alive in its own way. 20 people living inside a wooden frame built long before any of them were born. Space was tight. Privacy was rare. But Max had grown attached to the place. It gave him a sense of belonging he hadn't found downtown at the stationery shop, where his coworkers rarely said his full name correctly and often treated him as a fixture rather than a person. On the landing between the first and second floors, Max found 3 children crouched close together. They looked like sparrows huddled before a storm. They were usually loud at this hour, already arguing about who got the last pickled plum or who had stolen whose marbles. But this morning they whispered, glancing toward the front door as if expecting something. Max knelt beside them. "What are you 3 doing up so early?" he asked softly. The smallest girl pointed at the front entryway, eyes wide. "Someone knocked earlier," she whispered, really loud. Max straightened a little. He hadn't heard anything before waking, but the children rarely imagined fear. They absorbed it from the adults like sponges. He offered them a gentle look, urging them back toward their rooms, and then continued down the stairs. On the first floor, the light was thin and gray. The front door stood still. The windows facing the street showed only a quiet sidewalk and the faint glow of lanterns from the shops across the road. Max stepped toward the entryway to check the lock, expecting nothing more than a false alarm stirred by childhood imagination. Before he reached the door, it happened. A knock, sharp, heavy, deliberate, struck the wood with a force that rippled through the hallway. The sound echoed up the stairwell, cutting through every conversation, every thought, every quiet morning chore. It was the kind of knock that belonged to officials, not neighbors. The building seemed to flinch. The children upstairs gasped. Doors opened along the hallway. Slippers shuffled. Someone called out, "Who is it?" in a voice already trembling. Max felt something cold move through his chest. He didn't run toward the door. He walked slowly, bracing himself, bracing the building, bracing the breath of everyone watching from the stairs. He reached for the knob and hesitated just 1 second, listening to the silence that followed the knock. Behind him, the boarding house waited, all 20 people holding their breath inside thin walls that suddenly felt too fragile for whatever waited outside. He opened the door, and the day that had begun like any other shifted beneath his feet. Act 2. The knock that split the day. Max opened the door to find the landlord standing stiffly on the front steps. His shoulders pulled tight beneath his jacket. The morning fog drifted behind him, soft and colorless, but nothing about the man's expression felt soft. He held a single sheet of paper in his hand, edges flapping lightly in the cold breeze. The moment Max saw the bold black letters at the top, his stomach tightened before his mind could catch up. "Max," the landlord said quietly, as if lowering his voice could soften the strike. "Everyone needs to come downstairs." He didn't need to explain why. Max recognized the layout of the form immediately. He had seen copies taped to storefront windows downtown. The same headline, the same commanding tone. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. His heart slid downward in a slow, heavy drop. The landlord stepped inside, closing the door behind him as though he feared the paper might escape. He moved to the wall near the mailboxes and pinned the notice in place with 2 thumbtacks, pressing it flat with both hands. Max watched each motion, knowing this small, quiet act carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Above them, the stairwell filled with movement. Slippers scuffed. A door clicked shut. Someone whispered a prayer. Max turned and saw neighbors gathering with hesitant steps, drawn by the sound of the knock and the hush that followed. Some still wore night clothes, Others clutched sweaters or coats. Their faces held the same expression Max felt tightening across his own. Confusion layered over dread. Mrs. Kanda reached the bottom of the stairs first, one hand gripping her shawl. Her eyes found the notice, and she stopped mid-step, pressing the edge of her fingertips to her lips as she read. Behind her came Mr. Okabe, leaning heavily on the banister. The Nakamura sisters crowded together on the landing, trying to peer over heads that blocked their view. The boarding house felt smaller than it ever had. 20 lives pulled toward one sheet of paper. Max stepped aside to make space as more tenants gathered around the notice. The words printed there seemed to spread through the air, reshaping the room. People read slowly at first, then faster, their eyes moving with a fear that sharpened as comprehension dawned. Report. Register. Prepare. 6 days. Bring only what you can carry. The rules came like commands, clipped and absolute. A man near the front muttered that there had to be a mistake. A woman whispered about her father's failing legs. Someone asked what would happen to the trunks they hadn't opened in years. Voices rose and fell, not quite arguments, not yet, but close enough that the air felt charged. Max scanned the room. Children pressed against their parents, confused by the shift in tone. Adults looked at one another for reassurance no one could offer. The walls felt too thin to hold the weight of fear gathering inside them. The landlord cleared his throat and tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Max stepped forward instinctively, grounding himself in the space between the panic and the silence. "We'll take this one step at a time," he said gently, though his chest ached. "Let's stay together so we can understand what the notice requires." The room quieted just enough for his voice to settle. Max didn't command the space, he simply steadied it. People turned toward him not because he had answers, but because he wasn't unraveling. He read the notice out loud, line by line, explaining the English where it felt harsh or confusing. 6 days to pack. Storage options uncertain. Reporting to a civil control station. Instructions for tags, transport, and belongings. As he read, he heard sharp intakes of breath, muffled cries, a child asking why they had to leave at all. By the time he finished, the boarding house had shifted into something different. A place suddenly stripped of its familiar routines. The landlord stepped forward again, voice shaking. "You'll all need copies, and I'll help with whatever you need stored here." He gestured vaguely toward the basement door behind him. Even he didn't sound convinced the building could protect anything once they were gone. Max nodded, thanking him quietly. But inside, a memory pressed forward. His older brother stepping out into the night after Pearl Harbor to speak with federal agents, promising he'd be home by morning. He never returned. The echo of that absence settled over Max like a shadow. A child tugged at his sleeve. The smallest girl from earlier. "Max?" she whispered. "Are we in trouble?" He knelt, meeting her eyes with a softness he didn't quite feel. "No," he said, "but we have to get ready, and we'll do it together." Above them, more footsteps sounded as a few late sleepers rushed out of their rooms, hearing only fragments. 6 days, leave everything, report immediately. Max stood again, looking at the crowd folding into itself. Neighbors leaning on neighbors, families clutching one another, fear tightening like a thread running through the floorboards. The day had opened like any other. Now it hung on a single sheet of paper, reshaping their lives in the space of a morning. And the next step, the first of many, waited in the hall just beyond the notice. Act 3. The fracture in the hall. The boarding house didn't erupt all at once. Cracked slowly, the way old wood gives before it breaks. After the notice was read and read again, small knots of panic formed across the first-floor hallway. Some people stood frozen. Others whispered in rapid bursts. But the first sharp fracture came from the middle of the crowd, where two families shared the same narrow stretch of corridor. Max heard the raised voices before he saw them. Mr. Sato, a wiry man with restless eyes, clutched the handle of a trunk already half-packed with shoes, blankets, and pots. Beside him stood the Takeda family. Parents, 2 children, and an aging grandmother whose legs had weakened in recent months. The grandmother sat on a low stool, her hands folded atop her cane. "You can't take both trunks." Mrs. Takeda's voice shook, but her posture held firm. "We agreed each room gets one. We need the extra space for my mother." "It's first come, first served," Sato snapped. "I found this downstairs last night. I claimed it." "That's not what we said last week," Mrs. Takeda insisted. "Everyone agreed there had to be fairness." Sato's jaw locked. "Fairness? They're sending us away in 6 days, and you're talking about fairness?" The word rang through the hall, raw and brittle. Max stepped forward before the argument sharpened further. He touched the trunk Sato held, not grabbing it, only grounding the moment. "Let's slow down," he said, voice steady. "We have time to figure the trunks out." "We don't have time," Sato shot back. 6 days isn't time. 6 days is nothing. People turned toward them, drawn the way neighbors always are when fear transforms into conflict. The hallway pressed in closer. Max could feel every breath tightening, the walls narrowing around the group like a funnel. Mrs. Takeda motioned to her mother. "We have to pack bedding, the cane, extra clothes. She can't walk far." "And I have things too," Sato said. "My tools, my blankets, my documents." His voice cracked at the last word. "I'm not leaving everything behind." Max studied him. Beneath the anger was something deeper. Fear that mirrored the one Max tried to keep buried. Fear of losing everything in a world that had already started taking pieces of him. He spoke gently. "Mr. Sato, the trunk isn't the enemy. The notice is." Sato's shoulders rose and fell with a rough breath. Max glanced at the grandmother. Her eyes held a quiet apology for the chaos surrounding her. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled. "Let me help," Max said, and he crouched beside her. He lifted her carefully, guiding her weight onto his arm. The motion diffused the tension just enough for the others to breathe. Seeing Max help the grandmother shifted the room's energy. A few teenagers moved closer, willing to help carry things. Mrs. Kanda murmured encouragement from the stairs. Even Sato's posture softened, his grip loosening on the trunk. "We'll divide the space," Max said. "No one here leaves unprepared. That includes you." He nodded at Sato. "And it includes the Takeda family." Sato closed his eyes for a moment, fighting pride, fear, grief. Everything the notice dredged up at once. When he opened them again, he spoke more quietly. "Fine, we can share. Relief rippled through the hall. Not joy, not victory, just a fragile, temporary calm. Max eased the grandmother back onto her stool. She placed her hand on his forearm, her touch light but full of gratitude. "You remind me of my son," she whispered. "He always stepped between storms." Max didn't know what to say. The compliment hit a tender place he kept hidden, one shaped by his older brother's absence. Before he could respond, another wave of voices rose at the far end of the hallway. Someone had discovered a shortage of packing tags. Someone else worried about leaving valuables in the basement. A child started crying. The house was fraying in all directions at once. But the argument in front of him had eased. It wasn't perfect resolution, but it was enough to keep the house from splitting in two. Max took a slow breath, one crisis at a time, one thread to hold until the next one loosened. The boarding house wasn't collapsing yet, but he could feel the strain in every beam, every wall, every heart. The day had barely begun, and the first fracture had already formed. Act 4. The hallway that became a command post. The boarding house shifted after the first argument settled, as if the building itself exhaled and braced for whatever came next. Max felt the change in the air. The morning no longer carried the sleepy warmth of shared breakfasts or soft footsteps. Instead, the hallway thickened with purpose and fear, both pushing the residents into motion. It started with a single folding table dragged out from the storage closet beneath the stairs. Someone slid it into the center of the hallway, and within minutes it became the heart of the building. Paper spread across it like spilled cards, registration instructions, lists of approved items, scribbled notes about storage warehouses in Japantown, and questions no one had answers for yet. The boarding house had transformed into a command post without anyone naming it as such. Max moved between the table and the clusters of neighbors gathering around it. People approached hesitantly at first, then in steady waves. They asked what documents were required, what they should bring, who they should call about bank accounts suddenly frozen by executive orders. A few clutched envelopes of savings they didn't trust leaving behind. Some brought letters from employers afraid to keep them on payroll. The papers held lives in pieces, and Max did what he could to translate the fragments. He spread the evacuation order flat on the table, smoothing the corners. He read it aloud again, explaining the English phrasing carefully for the Nisei who struggled with legal vocabulary. The room hung quiet as he broke down each part. The civil control station location, the time windows for registration, the tagging requirements, the restrictions on luggage. People nodded slowly, absorbing instructions that reshaped their next 6 days. One tenant, Mrs. Fujiwara, held a stack of family photographs she had already placed in a shoebox. "Do you think we can take these?" she asked, her eyes uncertain. Max looked at the shoebox, then at her trembling hands. "If it fits inside your luggage, yes," he said. "And if it doesn't, we'll find a way." He didn't know how yet, but he meant it. Nearby, Mr. Okabe rummaged through a drawer he'd brought from his room, filled with ration stamps and crumpled receipts. He muttered to himself as he sorted, trying to decide what mattered enough to carry. Max guided him toward what the government would expect to see, helping him separate the useful from the sentimental. More tenants gathered around, some bringing stacks of clothes, others holding children's toys or pots and pans. The small space filled with the sound of shifting metal, soft arguments in Japanese, the rustle of paper tags being counted. Panic hadn't vanished. It had merely changed shape, dissolving into frantic organization. At the far end of the table, the Takeda children practiced writing their family number on tags. Their letters were shaky at first. Max placed a hand on the older sister's shoulder and showed her gently how to steady her wrist. She leaned into the guidance, eager to get it right, eager to help her family in whatever way she could. Not far away, the landlord hovered awkwardly, clutching a clipboard. He looked less like the man who collected rent each month and more like a figure unsure of how to protect the building he'd managed for decades. He cleared his throat and spoke to Max when the hallway's noise dipped into momentary quiet. "I'll keep the basement open," he said. "Anyone who needs storage, I'll do what I can." His voice held guilt more than authority. He knew, as they all did, that a basement was no guarantee of safety. Once the boarders were gone, Bush Street would shift. Looting wasn't unheard of. Vandals weren't rare. The building might stand, but empty buildings didn't stay respected for long. Max met his eyes and nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. Even if the promise was fragile, it mattered. The command post grew busier as the morning stretched on. People hurried up and down the stairs with armfuls of belongings, each trip revealing some forgotten corner of their lives. A pair of scissors kept from a sewing class years ago, a half-finished scarf, a wedding bowl wrapped in cloth. The boarding house was offering up its memories in slices. By midday, the table was surrounded by people asking questions Max couldn't always answer. Some asked about pets, others about bank withdrawals. A young man from the second floor asked whether they'd be split from their families once they arrived at the assembly center. Max swallowed his own fear before answering. "I think families will stay together as much as possible," he said, offering the hope he wished someone could give him. The children drifted in and out of the hallway, watching the adults shuffle papers and items with an urgency they didn't fully understand. One little boy tugged on Max's sleeve and whispered, "Is this like going on a long trip?" Max knelt beside him. "Something like that," he said. "We just have to prepare carefully." The boy nodded as if satisfied, then hurried off to show his sister a chipped toy truck he'd packed in a cloth bag. The boarding house thrummed with movement. Fear and cooperation wove together in a delicate balance. Max moved through it all, guiding, calming, answering, lifting, interpreting. Not because he had been told to, but because the house needed someone to anchor it. Someone who could hold the threads together while everything else scattered. By the time the sun reached the fog-silvered windows, Max realized he hadn't eaten breakfast. He wasn't hungry. His mind stayed fixed on the tasks ahead, on the 6 days that now felt smaller than they had an hour earlier. The hallway no longer resembled the place where neighbors traded jokes and shared late-night bowls of rice. It had become something else entirely. A war room made of fear, paper, and hope. And Max stood at its center, doing everything he could to keep the building from tearing itself apart. Act 5. Lines forming across Japantown. By early afternoon, the air in the boarding house felt thick with urgency. Every room echoed with the rhythm of packing. Folded clothes rustled. Suitcases snapped shut. Paper tags fluttered at the ends of strings. But the heaviest movement came not from inside the house, but from outside, Japantown itself was waking to the same impossible deadline. Max stepped out onto the front steps to breathe. Fog still clung to the morning's edges, though sunlight pressed through in thin bands. The street that usually offered a quiet mix of deliveries and passing neighbors had transformed into a procession. Families moved quickly, carrying bundles wrapped in furoshiki, suitcases that scraped against the ground, and children pulled along by the hand. The sidewalks filled with lines forming toward the civil control station down on Geary. The sight stopped Max. The scale of it hit him like a sudden gust. Dozens of families, hundreds maybe, all pushed into motion by the same sheet of paper pinned inside his hallway. He stood there a moment longer, letting the reality settle into his chest before returning inside. The boarding house needed guidance, especially those who couldn't navigate the lines alone. Upstairs, he found Mrs. Tanaka struggling with the clasps on her suitcase. Her hands shook, not from age, but from the fear she tried to hide behind polite nods. Max knelt and fixed the latch for her. She thanked him quietly, eyes lowered, as though embarrassed by the weight she carried. "You don't have to go alone," Max said. "We'll form a group." She exhaled, relieved. On the second floor, he found Eiko Harada folding her father's work shirts into a neat stack. Her movements were calm and methodical, but her eyes were swollen from crying earlier. She looked up when Max approached, offering a small nod that carried more gratitude than words. "Is your family ready for registration?" he asked. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Almost. My father doesn't want to leave his tools. He keeps arguing with the suitcase." Max smiled with a soft sympathy. "We'll help him prioritize. There's only so much we can carry." Eiko's gaze lingered on him longer than expected. "Are you going with the elders?" "That's the plan," Max replied. "They won't make it through the lines alone." Her expression warmed. "That sounds like you." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he turned it into a task. "If you can help the families with smaller kids, we can keep everyone on schedule." She nodded and rose, her presence adding another thread to the fragile network holding the boarding house together. Downstairs, the landlord held the front door open while two men carried an elderly neighbor down the stairs in a chair. The old man's legs were too weak for the climb, and his family worried about him collapsing before they reached the civil control station. Max stepped forward to support the group. "I'll walk with you," he said to the family. "We'll take it slow." The grateful look on the father's face gave Max a quiet strength he didn't realize he needed. The group began to form naturally. Mrs. Kanda leaning on her cane, Mr. Okabe clutching a folder of documents, the Takeda grandmother supported by her son and daughter. Max walked at the center of them, guiding the pace. He heard the sounds of drawers closing behind him as more families hurried down to join the line forming in the hallway. "Max!" someone called behind him. It was Junpei Sato, the man who had fought over the trunk earlier. His brow was furrowed, but his voice was calmer now. "Can you look over these?" He held out a bundle of papers, saving certificates, old receipts, letters. "I don't know what they'll ask for." Max took the papers and sorted them quickly. "Bring the certificates and the letters. Leave the rest in the trunk." He handed everything back with a steady nod. "You'll be fine." Sato swallowed hard, nodding once in return. That small exchange mended more than the argument earlier ever broke. When the group finally stepped outside, the world felt heavier. Japantown's streets swarmed with movement. People clutched belongings close to their chests. Mothers held infants wrapped tight against the cold. Men carried suitcases that strained their shoulders. The line toward the station stretched across the block, curving around the post office, growing longer by the minute. Max helped the elders find a place near the middle. Some people shuffled aside for them. Others stared with dull exhaustion. The weight in the air felt shared, but the fear remained personal. He stood with them until their paperwork was checked, until each family was called forward in turn. He explained any English the officers barked too quickly. He steadied trembling hands when signatures faltered, and he waited, patient and quiet, until the last member of his group completed registration. When they began the slow walk back to the boarding house, the sun hung low. It painted the edges of the rooftops gold, though nothing in the day felt warm. Max looked down the street and saw more families forming new lines, more households just receiving the news, more panic unfolding in waves he couldn't calm. The 6-day countdown had reached everyone. By the time he returned to Bush Street, he felt the exhaustion settle deep in his bones. He paused at the front steps, listening to the muffled activity inside the house. Packing, arguing, consoling, sorting. He stepped through the doorway, already preparing himself for the next crisis he would have to steady. The day had started with one knock. Now the entire neighborhood answered it. Act 6. Children needing a world that made sense. When Max returned to the boarding house, the noise inside felt sharper than before. The hallway hummed with adult voices. Too fast, too clipped, too heavy for young ears. But the children heard everything. They always did. Fear carried through thin walls better than laughter. At the foot of the stairs, 2 boys sat cross-legged beside a pile of wooden blocks they hadn't touched. The pieces lay scattered, untouched since morning. Their game had stopped the moment the notice went up. Max crouched beside them, keeping his voice gentle, steady. "Why aren't you building something?" he asked. One boy shrugged, keeping his eyes on the blocks. The other murmured, "Everyone's packing." Max nodded slowly. "That's true. But packing doesn't have to stop everything else." The first boy looked up, eyes wide and uncertain. "Are we leaving forever?" Max felt the question land like a stone dropped into water. Silent on the surface, heavy beneath. He held the boy's gaze, letting warmth anchor his reply. "We're leaving for a while," Max said. "And until then, we take care of each other. That doesn't have to stop." The younger child leaned against him, small and worried. Max wrapped an arm around him, offering what comfort he could before the hallway demanded his attention again. Upstairs, the Nakamura sisters paced the length of their narrow room. Their mother stood in the doorway, trying to fold clothing with trembling hands. 16-year-old Keiko looked at Max with a mixture of relief and frustration when he appeared. "Max, can you tell Mama she doesn't need to bring 4 kettles?" she whispered urgently. Their mother turned, clutching the kettles defensively. "They're good metal," she insisted. "Hard to get again." Max approached with a slow nod. "They are," he said. "But we only have 2 hands for carrying. Let's choose one. The strongest one." The mother stared at the kettles as if choosing between children. After a long breath, she handed him the least dented one. Max smiled softly. "This one will serve all of you well." Keiko mouthed a quiet thank you. In the next room over, a little girl named Naomi sat on her bed with her doll pressed tightly to her chest. She was usually a splash of brightness in the house. Chatty, curious, always skipping down the hallway. Now she sat perfectly still, as though moving might crack something already fragile inside her. Max stepped into the room. Naomi didn't look up. "Is your doll ready to go?" he asked lightly. She nodded without lifting her head. Max sat beside her, letting the silence settle between them before speaking again. "What's her name today?" he asked. "Same as yesterday," she whispered. "Hannah." A soft answer, a shrinking voice. Max gestured toward the doll's small cloth bag on the bed. "Think she'd like to help pack something?" Naomi finally looked up. "Like what?" "You tell me," he replied. She thought for a moment, then placed a tiny folded kimono inside the bag. "She needs this one," she said with a seriousness that made Max's chest ache. "You chose well," he said. "Hannah will be ready for whatever comes next." Naomi stared at him. "Will we?" The question was too large for any adult to answer honestly, let alone a child asking with wet eyes. Max breathed slowly, choosing his words with care. "We'll be ready together," he said. The answer wasn't perfect, but Naomi relaxed enough to lean her head on his shoulder, her doll tucked safely between them. Down the hallway, the landlord called for everyone to gather for a head count before dinner. Feet shuffled. Voices rose. The panic, muted for the children's sake, crept back into the adults' conversations like an unwelcome draft. Max guided Naomi back to her mother, then made his way down the stairs. He stopped midway when he heard a familiar, quiet sobbing. A teenage boy from the second floor sat with his back to the wall, hugging his knees. His father had been taken by the FBI months earlier. The evacuation notice had scraped open the wound. Max sat beside him. "You're allowed to be scared," he said, because no one else in the house dared speak the words aloud. The boy wiped his face roughly. "Everyone's trying to act strong." "Strong doesn't mean quiet," Max replied. "Strong means staying with each other, even when it's hard." The boy nodded slowly, breathing steadier now. The hallway downstairs grew louder, signaling the approach of another wave of questions. More packing decisions, more fraying edges needing to be knotted back together. Max rose to his feet. He looked back at the children, the ones huddled over blocks, the sisters helping their mother, Naomi with her doll, the teenage boy pressing on through grief, and felt the weight of their trust settle fully across his shoulders. It wasn't asked for. It wasn't assigned. It was simply given. The world outside the boarding house was unraveling. But inside these thin walls, Max had become something steady for the young ones who needed it. He took a deep breath and stepped back into the flow of the house, carrying their fragile hope with him. Act 7. The desperate hunt for space. By late afternoon, the boarding house felt like a hive overrun with urgency. Every family searched for whatever could hold the last pieces of their lives. The hallways echoed with the sounds of dragging trunks, opening drawers, and whispered arguments about what should stay and what could still be saved. Max moved from floor to floor, feeling the pressure of each room before he crossed its threshold. The storage room on the first floor had become the center of the storm. Usually, it held forgotten winter coats, broken umbrellas, and boxes labeled by tenants who had long since moved out. Now the door stood open, and people pushed inside, squeezing past one another as they reached for trunks stacked haphazardly against the back wall. Max stepped inside carefully. The air felt dusty and close, full of the smell of old wood and frayed rope. Two men knelt beside a large steamer trunk, testing the hinges to see whether it could survive another journey. Behind them, a teenage girl tried to pull down a smaller case from a high shelf, teetering on her toes. "Careful," Max said gently as he moved toward her. He steadied the shelf with one hand and lifted the trunk down with the other. The girl exhaled in relief. "Thanks," she whispered, brushing dust from the lid. "This was my mom's from before the Depression. She always said we'd never need it again." Max nodded, letting the weight of her words settle. No one had ever imagined needing these things again. Trunks meant travel, meant upheaval, meant an ending that didn't have a clear name yet. Across the room, Mr. Okabe stood beside two boxes of his late wife's belongings. Her brush, her silk scarf, her letters tied with faded string. He held her scarf gently, running his thumb along the edge as though memorizing the feel of it. When he saw Max, he offered a tired, fragile smile. "I don't know what to take," he said. "Everything reminds me of her." Max stepped closer. "What reminds you of her most?" Okabe lifted the letters. "These. She wrote them before we married. She kept everyone." "Then take those," Max said softly. "The memories travel with you. The rest can stay safe here." The older man nodded, folding the scarf back into one of the boxes, choosing love over weight. It was a small act of courage, but Max felt its power. Near the door, Sato sorted through tools scattered across the floor, hammers, levels, a small metal plane. He picked up each one, turned it in his hands, and sighed as he placed most of them aside. Only two fit in his luggage. When Max approached, Sato looked up, frustration sharpening his features. "I worked with these for years," he said. "Just leaving them behind feels like abandoning something." Max understood the ache. He had tools of his own, a notebook, a few books, a set of pens he used at the stationery shop. None of those things were heavy, but the thought of losing them still cut deep. He crouched beside Sato. "You're not abandoning them," Max said. "You're choosing what you can carry forward." Sato looked at the two tools he had kept. A small hammer and a chisel. Relief and sorrow mixed on his face. "I guess that's enough." "It's more than enough," Max replied. And for the first time since the morning's argument, Sato's shoulders eased. The room shifted again when Mrs. Kanda entered, leaning on her cane. She had come looking for a trunk that might fit her bedding and two sets of clothing. Max helped her search. The only thing left was an old crate with a loose lid. When Max opened it, the hinges squeaked like a quiet protest. "This will work," he offered. She frowned. "It's not much." "It's enough," Max said. She placed her hand on his arm, gratitude warm and steady. "You have become the heart of this house today," she whispered. "We would fall apart without you." Max swallowed the sudden heaviness in his throat. He wasn't sure if her words comforted him or deepened the weight across his shoulders. but he bowed his head slightly, accepting her thanks. When he carried the crate into the hallway, he found the children watching. They weren't touching anything, they simply observed, learning through silence. Naomi, holding her doll, traced her fingers along the edge of the crate as Max passed. "Is that yours?" she asked. "It's for Mrs. Kanda," he said. She touched the wood gently. "It's strong." "It is," he said. "It'll keep her things safe." She nodded with quiet approval. As the afternoon slipped toward evening, the boarding house filled with the sounds of choices being made. Objects treasured for years became negotiable. Items forgotten in corners suddenly became essential. Every decision felt like carving pieces of life into smaller fragments. Max felt the collective ache of it with every step he took. By the time the last trunk was carried out of the storage room, Max stood at the doorway, watching neighbors return to their rooms with the containers holding the sum of their lives. He felt a strange mixture of sorrow and admiration. This was what survival looked like. Not heroic, not grand, just the steady, painful choosing of what could be carried into a future no one asked for. As Max turned toward the stairs, he realized the boarding house had changed again. The frantic energy of the morning had settled into something quieter, heavier. The first wave of panic had passed. What remained was the slow, deliberate work of letting go. And Max, exhausted but steady, began climbing the stairs to help with whatever came next. Act 8. Rumors, loyalties, and quiet accusations. Evening crept across the boarding house in a slow, gray drift. The frantic movement of the afternoon faded into a different kind of tension. People spoke in quieter voices now, but every word carried a sharper edge. Packing had shifted from chaos to strategy, and with strategy came suspicion, rumors, and the fragile alliances that held their home together. Max felt it the moment he stepped out of the storage room hallway. Conversations stopped when he passed. Doors paused halfway shut. Neighbors who had worked in harmony hours earlier watched one another with guarded eyes. Fear did that. It didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered. In the second-floor corridor, he found a group clustered near the stairwell. Mrs. Takeda, the Nakamura sisters' mother, and two men from the third floor. They spoke in hushed tones, their words darting like shadows. "He told me they have a cousin outside the district," one man whispered. "They might try to leave early." "You can't blame them," another replied. "Wouldn't you leave if you could?" Mrs. Takeda shook her head sharply. "If they go early, it might draw attention. It might bring the authorities here. We should go together. We should stay together." Max stepped closer. The group looked up, startled, caught between fear and guilt. "Who's leaving early?" he asked calmly. One man gestured toward the end of the hallway. "The Fujimotos. Their son said they're packing to go tonight." Max's pulse tightened. The Fujimotos were quiet but careful people. He had never known them to risk anything boldly. But desperation changed people. The idea of fleeing before the forced departure wasn't surprising. It was just dangerous. He nodded. "Let me talk to them." As he walked toward their door, he overheard another conversation. Two teenage boys whispering about hiding jewelry somewhere the soldiers wouldn't check. A mother pulling her daughter inside before she could ask too many questions. Someone muttering about whether the landlord would steal whatever trunks were left in the basement. Thin walls carried everything, even the thoughts people tried not to say aloud. When Max reached the Fujimoto door, he knocked softly. There was a rustle inside, then silence. He waited. After a moment, the door opened an inch. Mrs. Fujimoto's eyes peered through the gap. "Max?" she whispered. He kept his voice gentle. "Are you all right?" She hesitated, then opened the door wider. Inside, their room looked half-packed, half-abandoned. Folded clothes sat on the bed. A crate was open on the floor. Two children huddled near the window, clutching small bags. Her husband stood by the closet, shoulders stiff with embarrassment at being caught. "We thought," she began, then faltered. "We thought if we left tonight, maybe we could make it to Stockton. My brother lives there." Max stepped inside the room slowly, lowering the intensity in the air. "Did you hear something that made you think you had to go now?" Her husband stepped forward. "People were saying the lines were too long, that they might start arrests if people didn't show quickly. We didn't want to wait for soldiers." Max let out a slow breath. The rumors were spreading faster than facts. A dangerous rhythm. "No one's arresting for late packing," he said gently. "And if you try to leave the district, that's when things get worse. Leaving early puts your whole family at more risk." Mrs. Fujimoto's eyes watered. "We just didn't want to be split apart." Max softened. "I understand, truly. But going together with the boarding house keeps everyone safer. You won't face it alone." The couple exchanged a long look. Their children watched, desperately waiting for someone to tell them which fear to follow. After a moment, Mr. Fujimoto nodded. "We'll stay." Relief loosened the room. Max helped them repack a few items, organizing the bags more efficiently. As he left, the children managed weak smiles, clinging to the sense of safety he'd offered. Back in the hallway, the tension lingered. Neighbors still watched one another warily, gauging who might break next. That uncertainty formed a thin crack running down the center of the house. Max walked through each corridor, checking on people one by one. He didn't speak loudly, didn't offer speeches. He simply showed up, steady, familiar, present. It was enough to quiet arguments before they grew sharp. At one point, he found Eiko Harada sitting on the stairs, fingers laced tightly in her lap. "You're walking in circles," she said softly when she saw him. "Trying to keep things from falling apart," he admitted. Her gaze held warmth that softened the edges of his exhaustion. "You always do that," she said. "You carry what everyone else drops." He exhaled slowly, grateful for her presence. "Someone has to keep the peace." "Not alone," she replied. Her words sank deeper than she knew. As the sky outside darkened, the boarding house settled into a cautious quiet. The rumors hadn't vanished. They drifted like cigarette smoke, but Max's steady movement through the halls held the house in something resembling unity. People still feared one another's choices. They still worried someone might take too much space, too many supplies, too many favors. But the house had not split. Not yet. And Max, for another day, had kept it from breaking. Act 9. Rumors, loyalties, and quiet accusations. The sky outside had turned the color of cold ash by the time Max reached the first floor again. Evening settled over the building in heavy layers, and the boarding house responded with subdued voices and quieter footsteps. The frenzy of the day had softened, but the tension hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply sunk deeper, settling into the beams and floorboards like moisture the walls couldn't repel. Max found the landlord standing alone near the basement door, holding a clipboard that wasn't helping him anymore. The man's shoulders sagged in a way Max had never seen. Usually he carried himself like he knew how the building would bend and when it would creak. Tonight he looked like someone trying to memorize a home he could no longer protect. "You're still working?" Max asked gently. The landlord startled slightly, then exhaled. "I'm checking the storage list," he said, though the papers in his hand were disorganized. "Trying to keep track of what everyone's leaving behind." The truth revealed itself in the tremor at the edge of his voice. Max didn't push. He waited, letting the silence open a space the landlord could step into. After a moment, the older man's grip tightened on the clipboard. "I don't know if I can keep it all safe," he admitted. "The trunks, the boxes, the valuables. Once the building's empty, you know how people are. Folks will think everything in here is free for the taking." Max leaned against the wall opposite him. "You're doing what you can." The landlord shook his head. "I've been watching Bush Street change for 30 years. When tenants move out, even for a week, people test doors. They try windows. And this time," he swallowed hard, "this time there will be 40 empty rooms. 40 unlocked futures." Max stepped closer. "You're not responsible for what this order is forcing on everyone." The landlord let out a strained laugh. "I'm responsible for this place. Always have been." He glanced toward the stairwell as if seeing every tenant at once. "You all trusted me with your homes. Now I'm supposed to protect them after you're taken away." That word, taken, hung between them. Heavy, unspoken all day, now unavoidable. Max felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent the entire day helping others keep their balance. But here, for the first time, was someone older, someone in authority, suddenly small under the weight of lost control. "Then let me help," Max said quietly. The landlord blinked. "Help? I'll organize the basement. We'll label everything. Lock what can be locked. Store things the safest way we can. And we'll do it together." The landlord's eyes glistened. Not from tears exactly, but from relief so tired it bordered on grief. "You've done enough today." "I haven't," Max replied. "Not if you're standing down here alone with a clipboard you can't look at." The older man let out a breath that seemed to escape from somewhere deep. He sat on the edge of the basement step, staring at the floor as if grounding himself. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "A tenant I used to have upstairs years ago. He always stepped in when trouble hit the house. Said he didn't like seeing people turn against each other. Said he'd rather take the load than watch others struggle." He paused. "He was drafted in 42. Never came back." Max stood still, absorbing the weight of the memory. "I'm not him," he said gently. "No," the landlord replied. "But the house recognizes that kind of spirit." The compliment settled quietly over Max. Neither praise nor burden. Just truth offered without expectation. They moved into the basement together. The bulb overhead flickered weakly but cast enough light for them to see the space. Trunks lined the walls in uneven rows. Some were tied shut with rope. Others had worn leather straps that looked ready to break. Boxes sat in stacks, each with names written in hurried script. Max knelt beside the first trunk and checked the latch. If we sort the heavy ones toward the back, we can stack the lighter ones near the door, he said. Easier to move, harder to steal. The landlord nodded, the faintest sign of strength returning. They worked silently for a while, lifting, sorting, stacking, labeling. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and stories that would be left behind. Midway through, the landlord spoke again. I know people think I'm strict, he said. Maybe I am, but I care about this place. I know, Max said. And I care about you all, the landlord added. The words pushed out like something he had held back too long. More than I've said. Max met his eyes. We know that too. The basement grew orderly slowly, box by box. And for the first time that day, Max felt a shift that wasn't fear or panic or resignation. It was something steadier, human connection, forged not in desperation but in the simple act of two people trying their best in the dark. When they finished, they stood at the doorway for a long moment, looking at the rows of packed belongings. It'll never be perfect, the landlord murmured. It doesn't have to be, Max replied. It just has to be honest. The landlord nodded, shoulders lifting slightly. Thank you, Max. Max took a slow breath. We take care of each other, he said. The landlord locked the basement door, placing the key in his breast pocket with quiet ceremony. As Max climbed the stairs back into the hallway, he felt the weight of the building settle differently around him. Less frantic, less fragmented, still trembling at the edges, but held by the fragile ties of a community that refused to fall apart. Night was deepening now, and the house, for all its cracks, still stood. Act 10. The last shared meal. The smell reached Max before he even stepped into the dining room. Steamed rice stretched thin with barley, miso broth warmed from the last block of paste. A few canned peaches opened for the children because the adults agreed they didn't need sweetness tonight. Hunger had threaded its way through the boarding house all day, but no one had paused long enough to feel it until now. Max entered the room quietly. A handful of residents were already seated at the long wooden table, its surface scarred by years of shared meals, spilled tea, and late-night conversations that softened the hardest weeks. The room felt different tonight. Not tense, not frantic, but solemn, like a gathering before a long journey. Chairs scraped gently as more families filed in, carrying bowls and small plates. The landlord lit the flickering overhead bulb, which cast a warm but unsteady glow across the table. For the first time since morning, the hallway outside settled into stillness. The entire building seemed to inhale together. Mrs. Kanda sat near the head of the table, her cane resting beside her chair. The Takeda grandmother leaned gently against her granddaughter. Sato took a spot across from them, shifting awkwardly as if still unsure how to sit among people he'd argued with just hours ago. Even the children sensed the gravity of the moment. They whispered instead of chattering, their eyes scanning the adults for cues. Max stood near the doorway, watching as the room filled. He felt the ache of the day in his shoulders, but he also felt a strange warmth rising, something like gratitude. Maybe not for the circumstances, but for the way the boarding house gathered now, together, one last time before everything changed. Eiko Harada approached with 2 bowls in her hands. Sit, she said softly. nudging him toward an empty chair. "You haven't eaten since last night." Max offered a tired smile and took the seat beside her. "There wasn't time." "There's time now," she said, placing one bowl in front of him. Max looked down at the miso broth, thin, watery, barely more than a memory of flavor, but it felt like a gift. Survival food shared in solidarity. The meal began without ceremony. Chopsticks clicked gently against bowls. Soft murmurs filled the air. No one laughed loudly, but small conversations blossomed like fragile flowers after rain. Mr. Okabe spoke first. He looked at the scarf tucked carefully into his pocket, the one he had chosen to leave behind, and told a few stories about his wife. How she burned rice the first month they were married. How she insisted on listening to the radio every night even if she didn't understand the English. His voice wavered, but the room absorbed every word with quiet tenderness. Across the table, Sato chimed in with a story about his first job in San Francisco, sweeping the floors of a fish market on Grand Avenue. He spoke with a cautious humor, as if unsure whether he was allowed to be lighthearted tonight. But the smiles that rose around the table reassured him. The mood warmed slowly. Not joy, just human closeness, rebuilt after the day's fractures. Keiko Nakamura told a story about her teacher who insisted the girls learn English grammar by reciting poems aloud. Her younger sister recited one, shy at first, then louder, earning gentle applause from the adults. Eiko leaned toward Max. "This room feels different tonight," she whispered. "How?" he asked. "Like everyone remembers how much they need each other." Max nodded. "They do." A soft voice from the far end of the table, Naomi, the little girl with the doll, asked if they would still eat together wherever they were going. Her mother ran a hand through her hair. "We'll share meals again," she promised, though uncertainty pulled at the edges of her words. Max felt the truth of that ache. The boarding house wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a shared existence, a web of interdependent lives. Tonight, they tried to hold onto that before the forced scattering began. The landlord rose at one point, clearing his throat. Everyone looked up. "I know I'm not always easy," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. A few people chuckled softly, acknowledging his reputation without malice. He continued, voice steady but worn. "This house has carried many people over the years, and it carried all of you. Whatever happens in the next 6 days, I hope you'll remember this place as your home." It was simple, but the sincerity settled in the room like a blessing. Max lowered his gaze. He felt something close in his throat, a mixture of grief and gratitude. The landlord's words loosened memories of his own family dinners before his older brother disappeared, before the war turned everything uncertain. He forced his breath steady and lifted his eyes again. The meal continued. People ate slowly, savoring each bite as if imprinting it into memory. The canned peaches were divided among the children first, who shared them with surprising generosity. A few of the adults were given slivers too, passed along by small hands determined to spread sweetness evenly. When the bowls were finally empty, no one moved at once. People lingered, letting the warmth of the room settle into their bones. The boarding house felt, for a moment, safe again, whole again, a temporary sanctuary before the storm resumed. Eiko whispered, "I wish we could freeze this moment." Max nodded quietly. So do I. Outside, night thickened along Bush Street. Inside, the last shared meal folded itself into the house's memory. A memory Max knew he'd carry wherever they went next. Act 11. Packing the walls with lives. After dinner, the boarding house shifted again. The warmth of the meal, thin as it had been, faded into the corridors as people rose from the table and drifted back to their rooms. For a few quiet minutes, the house held a rare stillness. But then the soft scrape of trunks, the rustle of clothing, and the low murmur of anxious voices began weaving through the floors once more. Max walked up the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of fatigue climb with him. But as he reached the second-floor landing, the sight that greeted him gave him pause. The hallway looked narrower now, crowded with stacked belongings. Suitcases, crates, bundles tied with furoshiki, paper bags ready to split at the seams. Everything leaned against the walls like a fragile museum exhibit of what each family had chosen to carry into an unknown future. A pair of children's boots rested in front of the Takeda room. A pair of well-worn work gloves sat on top of a crate labeled in careful brushstrokes. A small tabletop radio, wrapped in cloth and string, waited near the staircase, humming faint memories of pre-war music. Every object held a story, and every story was shrinking into a smaller shape to fit inside the allotted luggage. Max bent down to adjust a frayed rope around a large suitcase when he heard soft sobbing from down the hall. He recognized the voice immediately, Aiko's younger cousin, May. She sat near her family's door, knees pulled to her chest, staring at a pile of possessions her mother had told her she couldn't bring. Max approached quietly and sat beside her on the floor. She didn't look up right away. "These things don't fit?" he asked gently. She shook her head, wiping her sleeve across her face. "Mama says I can only take one." In front of her lay a stack of books, each worn from reading. Japanese folktales, picture books, an English primer she had only recently begun practicing with. "But they all feel like me." Max rested his hands on his knees. "If you could carry only one memory with you," he said, "which book would hold it best?" May looked at the stack, swallowing hard. After a long moment, she picked up the folktale book, Mama Taro. Its cover faded but bright in spirit. She clutched it to her chest. "That one carries your courage," Max said softly. "And you're bringing that with you." She managed a small smile. He stood and placed the other books gently into a crate her mother would store downstairs. May slipped her hand into his for a brief second before letting go and returning to her room. Down the hall, Max heard the thump of something heavy. Sato struggled to tie down the lid of a trunk overstuffed with blankets and tools. The rope snapped with a harsh twang. "Too much," Sato muttered, frustrated. Max crossed the hall. "Let me help." Together they pulled the rope tighter, adjusting the blankets until the trunk closed without protest. It took effort and quiet coordination, but eventually the knot held. Sato stepped back and exhaled, relief softening the hard line of his jaw. "I thought today would break us," Sato said quietly. Max nodded. "It tried." They exchanged a look, one of gratitude, not apology, and Sato returned to his room, leaving Max alone with the rows of belongings that now defined the hallway. As he moved down the corridor, he noticed the soft glow of lamplight coming from the Hirata room. Eiko stood inside, folding a blouse into her suitcase. The rest of her things were neatly arranged around her, everything placed with deliberate care. When she noticed Max at the doorway, she motioned for him to step in. "Everything fits," she said, though her smile carried a shadow of sadness. "But it feels strange choosing what parts of your life get to follow you." Max leaned against the doorframe. "It's the same in every room." She placed the blouse inside the suitcase and pressed it closed. "Do you think we'll remember all this? Years from now?" He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her posture, at the way she moved with determination despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "We'll remember," he said, "even the things we had to leave behind." Eiko lowered her gaze. "I hope we remember the good parts, too." Before he could answer, a soft knock echoed through the hallway. It was Naomi holding her doll against her chest. Her mother stood behind her carrying a small cloth bag. "Max," Naomi said. "Mama says the doll's tag came off." He knelt, taking the small paper tag she held out. The string had frayed, barely holding. He retied it carefully, double knotting it so it wouldn't loosen again. Naomi watched intently, as if he were performing a small miracle. When he finished, she hugged the doll close. "Thank you," she whispered. Max smiled and rose again, watching as Naomi and her mother returned to their room. Eiko stood quietly behind him, her expression soft. "Do you realize how many people rely on you?" she asked. Max shook his head. "I just move where I'm needed." "That's exactly what I mean." He didn't respond. He didn't know how. By the time he returned to the hallway, the floor was nearly impassable, every wall lined with neatly stacked lives. The house felt heavier now, as though the memories packed into suitcases pulled at the floorboards themselves. People drifted back into their rooms, preparing for sleep. The packing was done. The choices had been made. All that remained was the night. Max stood in the hallway, absorbing the quiet. The day had stripped everything down to essentials: objects, emotions, relationships. Nothing extra remained. He touched the top of one suitcase lightly, a gesture of respect, then turned toward his own room. The house breathed around him, weighed down by everything it would soon lose. Tonight, the boarding house held the last shapes of a life about to disappear. Tomorrow, even the walls would begin to feel different. Act 12. A house asleep in fear. Night settled over the boarding house with the softness of falling ash. From the street, the building looked the same as it had every evening for decades. 3 stories of weathered wood, lantern light flickering behind thin curtains, the quiet hum of Japantown beyond its walls. But inside, the stillness carried a different weight. The kind of silence that forms only when everyone is afraid to admit they're afraid. Max climbed the stairs slowly. The hallway lights were dimmed, a soft amber glow stretching across the stacked luggage pressed against every wall. It made the belongings look like sleeping animals, still restless, waiting. Floorboards whispered beneath his feet. Most doors were cracked open, as if the families inside couldn't decide whether to keep the night out or invite company in. He reached his room and paused at the doorway. His own suitcase sat half-packed at the foot of the bed, a shirt folded too neatly, a photograph of his family laid face down so he wouldn't have to look at the absence of his older brother, a small pouch of ink pens from the stationery shop. the few objects that represented a life that had never felt finished. Max sat on the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees. The smell of miso from dinner lingered faintly in the air. Beneath it came the sound he'd grown used to over months of living in this building. Other people's breathing. The thin walls carried every inhalation, every sigh, every shift in blankets. Tonight those sounds felt amplified, woven together like the heartbeat of the house. He leaned back against the wall, letting the vibrations settle into him. Through the paneling he heard Mr. Okabe humming quietly. An old tune, barely audible, something from before the war. Below that, the Takeda grandmother coughed softly in her sleep. A child murmured in a dream. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else suppressed tears. Max didn't need to see any of them to know exactly how they lay. Curled inward, waiting for sleep to pull them away from thoughts they weren't ready to name. The house felt like one shared breath. Max closed his eyes. He tried to let the rhythm collect his thoughts, but his mind kept circling back to the same memory. His brother stepping into the dark that night all those months ago, promising he would return after talking to the FBI. Max could still hear the sound of the door closing behind him. He remembered waiting by the window until dawn. Waiting the next day. Waiting for weeks. The empty silence afterward had shaped a part of him that never quite healed. Now the entire boarding house seemed to echo that same silence. A silence before disappearance. He let out a slow exhale and pushed the memory back into the drawer where he kept it tucked away. Tonight wasn't about his past. It was about everyone else sleeping in this fragile house, trusting him without ever saying it aloud. A soft knock tapped against his door. "Max?" A voice whispered. It was Eiko. He rose and opened the door halfway. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her lamp casting a faint halo behind her. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "It feels like the whole building is holding its breath." Max stepped aside, and she entered quietly. She moved to the window and looked down at the empty street. The fog had thickened. The world beyond Bush Street seemed to vanish into it. "I keep thinking," she said softly, "how tomorrow will look exactly the same from outside. Same street, same shops, same morning fog. But everything inside these rooms will be gone." Max stood beside her. "We'll carry the important parts with us." She nodded, though her eyes softened with a grief he recognized. "I just didn't think leaving would feel this quiet." "It's always quiet before something breaks," Max said, then caught himself. "Or before something survives." She looked at him then, really looked at him the way someone does when trying to memorize a face before the world changes it. "You held this house together today," she whispered. Max shook his head gently. "People held each other. But because you kept moving," she said. "People follow steadiness, even when it's tired." Her words settled into him like warmth he didn't know he needed. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Eiko stepped back toward the door. "Try to sleep," she said. "Tomorrow will ask more of us." Max nodded. "You too." When she left, the hallway dimmed again. Max returned to his bed, settling beneath the thin blanket. The air had cooled, and the wooden frame creaked lightly under him. He closed his eyes and listened again to the breathing through the walls. He let it lull him, steady him, remind him that even in fear, the house still lived, still beat, It still held the last pieces of their old world in its fragile ribs. As sleep finally began to pull at him, Max understood something he hadn't been able to articulate all day. This building had never simply been a place to live. It had been a vessel for 20 intertwined lives, and tonight it carried the weight of all their hopes, their grief, their stories, their final moments of belonging. And by dawn, that vessel would begin to empty. Max drifted into sleep with the sound of shared breath around him. The last night the boarding house would ever breathe this way.
Thank you for listening to this story. If this journey spoke to you, you'll find more chapters across our channel exploring the daily life, resilience, and human truth inside the Japanese-American concentration camps, otherwise known as internment camps, during World War II. Every view helps us keep these narratives alive with care and accuracy. Rest well, and we'll see you in the next story. This is a developing archive of Japanese-American wartime sleep stories and other Asian-American historical narrative stories. If you'd like to continue learning in this quiet way, please like the video and subscribe. Our growing library is ready whenever you need it. If you're a storyteller yourself and would like to collaborate on a story, you'll find contact information on our website at redressradio.com.